Hi guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we're going to do a comparison video, and this is going to be a comparison video on the house of Ted Lapidus, and it's going to be on one of my favorite fragrances of all time, which is Lapidus Pour. I guess I should hold the bottle in the right hand where I've got the juice sprayed. So, current formulation on my left hand, vintage formulation on my right hand. I also have dry downs on blotters. I've got modern right here so I can smell the late dry down and the vintage. So, let's get into this. Before I get started, I just want to say that this is my second comparison video. I did one on the house of Roja Parfum's Enigma Parfum Cologne versus Enigma Parfum. And I said those were very close to each other. These are a little bit more, different, the vintage versus the modern formulation. However, I must say that I do think that the modern formulation is quite good. The reason that I love this fragrance so much is because it's so different from so many other things that you would go smell today. It has that 80s feel to it. And I'll show you a couple fragrances that I think it has bits and pieces of inside of it. But this is its own composition in and of itself. Just a little bit of background. It was created in 1987 by Martin Gras. And apparently he did other fragrances for the house of Ted Lapidus. And he did Cheruti 1881 and a couple other things. So experience knows. And like most 80s fragrances, it is chocked full of notes. And, I could read you the notes, but I don't think that it would give you an idea of how it would smell. However, before we get into some of the different, the differences in how these smell, I do want to say that in the Roja Parfums video comparison, I basically said that the biggest difference in the opening was that the Parfum, smelled like actual wild cherry Pepsi, and the Parfum Cologne smelled like it was a diet. That was the easiest way to kind of think about the opening between the two. The easiest way to think about the differences between the vintage and the modern formulation of this one, to me, are, imagine you have a heavy spray of the vintage on your right hand, and you just take it and you imprint it. But when it imprints, it doesn't actually give a full carbon copy of the smell. It just kind of gives you an idea, a photocopy of the smell onto your left hand. And it's a little bit more synthetic, which I think a lot of the stuff I'm going to say, I think you inherently would know. I've been wearing it all day. It is my scent of the day. But before we kind of get into some of the differences, let me show you some of the fragrances that I think are inside of this fragrance and what has, the time frame, what's inspired it and stuff like that. So the first one is, by the way, this fragrance is made up of a couple different main accords. Number one is it has that pissy floral vibe that 80s fragrances for men started to kind of get into, which I actually love. And you'll see from a couple of the other fragrances that I own, I love it enough that I got some pretty big bottles of those type of fragrances. So it has the pissy florals. It also has the animalic castoreum and civet. Like fragrances from the 80s, from the decade. It has this animalic pissy honey, which again, I love. I love honey. Honey's one of my favorite notes, right up there with leather. Leather, and then maybe honey is just a touch below because I love leather so much, but I love honey in fragrances. It adds this, animalic vibe because, Rich Mitch said on a couple videos that inherently bees stink. Most people don't realize that, but honey can be animalic depending on how it's used. It doesn't just have to add sweetness. And we'll get into that later on in the comparison as well. So the first one that I want to show you when we talk about these floral fragrances, because there's some beautiful pissy florals in this fragrance, and that is Iquitos for men. This is a fragrance that gives you this beautiful floral vibe from the 80s. It's a It is a hidden gem fragrance now. A lot of people look for this because it's heavy oak moss. There's heavy oak moss in the vintage of this as well. But the florals in this are outstanding. And the jasmine in this is outstanding. So that's one. Number two pissy floral is Paco Rabanne Tenere. Now, I bought a 25 ml of this, and I loved it so much, I got a 200 ml. And again, this is a splash, but so what? I just decant it and use it whenever I want. But as far as like 80s pissy floral vibe, along with Lapidus Pour, you've got Tenere, which is an under-the-radar 80s scent. Look at that presentation, by the way. You know, most people don't talk about this fragrance. I almost never hear it spoken about, by the way, but I love this fragrance just as much as I love Lapidus Pour. These two are two loves for me. And then when you talk about animalic honey, there's two that comes to mind. One where the castoreum is really amped up, one where other notes are amped up. I love them both equally. It's like choosing a child. The animalic honey is boss number one. Again, animalic honey here as well, done a little bit differently, but still, these are two of the best animalic honey fragrances in the game. And then the best civet fragrance in the game is this. Of course, Kouros. A lot of people compare this to Kouros. I will tell you that I don't get the comparison as much when you compare vintage type style bottle to vintage bottle. However, I will tell you that when you compare the modern formulation with a more modern formulation of a civet type fragrance, like for example, Jacques Bogart's own Furio, the modern take, whatever they're using, civetone or whatever that synthetic civet is, you know, I can sense the similarities, especially in the first 30 seconds to a minute when you spray the fragrance immediately. You get this very similar vibe between these two, which you do not get between the vintage. The vintage is a splash, by the way. So if you see me holding a splash, that's the vintage. And the modern formula is a spray. And so, you know, when you compare the modern formula, which is on this hand, to spraying something like Furio, which is obviously a synthetic, you know, formulation. It's not as high quality as Kouros, let's say. You do smell that synthetic civet note here, and it really compares. And I think that's what they've used to give that animalic honey accord, or animalic accord, I should say, not honey, but animalic accord. Whereas here, I don't think it's the synthetic civet as much as it's the natural oak moss, and you know, the natural, if they did use, I doubt they used real civet, but maybe the quality of the ingredients were higher back then. The other difference, by the way, that I really should talk about is the sweetness. And so whenever you spray these two, instantly, for the first 15 or 20 minutes, 30 minutes even, they are vastly different. As they start to dry down, they start to get closer and closer together. I think this is a very good reformulation. I'm glad I have this bottle because I do enjoy it. But one thing I never noticed wearing it on its own, oh God, it's so good. I love this fragrance, is the sweetness. So in the modern formulation, which by the way, if anyone can tell, I have no clue what all this means, but that is my batch code on the modern. And the vintage, all it has is, it has this, right here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the screen because it's barely imprinted into the bottle itself. But there's a tiny little code listed that says 4K10 if you look in the light. Again, I have no clue what that means. But I know that this bottle only had 3 ingredients listed or so. It was water, alcohol, fragrance, and this one had a list of ingredients about this long. So you can tell they're from different eras, definitely. And so you know, that is something that comparing the two really stuck out that I never noticed before. When you spray the vintage versus the modern, the vintage comes out of the gate like a fighter jet. I mean, it hits you with growl immediately. And it's a natural type feel. It feels like, you know, if you've worn vintage fragrances like Balenciaga's Portos, which was discontinued in the 80s, so there are no more modern bottles. If you're buying a bottle of that, it is a vintage bottle. If you've worn fragrances like Vintage Jules by Dior, which was released, I think, in 1980 or 81 as well, you know, those type of fragrances, they have this base that's made up of this oak moss and patchouli and, you know, civet normally, castoreum, and they give you this type of 80s feel that I don't think modern synthetics have been able to recreate. They've done a very good job trying, but when you're comparing the two, you can definitely tell this, even though it is, you know, it is harsher, it's longer lasting. I don't even know if it's necessarily it projects more, but I enjoy it much longer into the dry down, which, by the way, this is a, whatever it is, 6-hour spray, and this I sprayed on eight hours ago or so. And so, you know, I could smell the late dry down between the modern, which is very nice, and the vintage. And so just to give you guys a quick rundown of the scent, there's this fruity pineapple top, which if you love Aventus, this is an interesting fragrance because, you know, Aventus kind of took the DNA of this fruity pineapple top and they mixed it with this Chypre base with oak moss and, you know, a lot of manly notes, I should say. The older bottles, you know, were dirtier with the birch tar amped up and stuff like that. So it kind of took a similar structure of the pyramid, but modernized it. I heard someone say that Aventus is like a modern mansion. You know, it's a modern glass mansion built, you know, with modern technology, and that's a perfect analogy. This is not a modern mansion. This is a old school house that was built 50, 100 years ago that's still beautiful in its own right. Even more so beautiful than what you get today because there's so much different, you know. It's not mass produced. A lot of the stuff was made by hand. That's the analogy that I get between the two. But I only bring up Aventus because of that pineapple top. This was done in 1987, and the perfumer used that pineapple top. And then there is this honey incense vibe. So you get this dirty animalic honey mixed with incense, and then you get this pissy floral vibe that you also get in some of these other fragrances that I mentioned that I love so much. And so there is this jasmine, lily of the valley, rose with pine. There's a lot of things going on in this fragrance, by the way. There's lavender in the top. There's artemisia and juniper and lemon and basil and bergamot in the top. And then there's tobacco, patchouli, oak moss, amber, musk, sandalwood, tonka bean, cedar in the base. Now, that tobacco note, once you get to the dry down, once you hit about 3 hours or so on the dry down, the fragrances start to come together. And I think it's because the tobacco note can still be done very well, even in modern perfumery. There's nothing that, you know, takes that away. There's nothing that, you know, would force a modern formula, let's say, to go off course from what the vintage formula is. But how you get there over the 3 hours vastly differs. And in fact, it differs way more on skin. Yeah, it differs way more on skin than it does on the blotter. So you can still sense the differences, but if you just spray this on paper, if you spray the modern on paper and then spray the vintage on paper, you're not going to be able to pick out the nuances as much. On your skin, they definitely stand out. And this is better quality. This is more natural. It's less synthetic. This almost feels plasticky to me in a way, if that makes sense. So even though it has that same DNA that you spray and it shocks you, it takes you back a little bit, because this is not a modern perfume. Men are not walking around smelling like this. Well, I am, but most men nowadays in their 30s are not walking around smelling like Lapidus Pour Homme. This is something to be enjoyed, cherished. This is something to be, to wear, to really discover the differences in what used to be considered perfumery and what is now. And for someone like me that loves vintage fragrances, this is a masterpiece. No doubt about it. I will say that. Even the modern formulation is quite good. Even though it has that synthetic feel like Furio, where they kind of feel a little bit the same at the opening, I feel like they had to do that based on IFRA regulations. And so, even though it feels a little bit more synthetic, the oak moss feels sharper in the vintage compared to the more synthetic modern formulation. The animalic and the honey, the pissy honey that I love so much, is amped up in the vintage. Yeah, and it just growls out of the gate at you. As soon as you spray, you'll be able to tell the differences. But again, in the dry down, once it hits that 3-hour mark, I feel like the tobacco and the musks have kind of allowed them to really make this fragrance start to really come together, and it gets harder and harder to pick out nuances and differences in the fragrance. So the biggest question, I think, comes down to, is it worth splurging for a vintage? This is a very cheap fragrance. I think you can get 100 ml for 20 or 25 bucks for Lapidus Pour Homme. For the modern. For the vintage, you have to pay a little bit more. I think I paid $40 a bottle here, and it's 50 ml, not 20 or 25 for 100. To me, for somebody with a very large collection where I probably will not finish 100 ml of vintage juice, because I got 2 of them, yes, it's absolutely worth it. This is truer to what it was supposed to be. This is not even the original, I don't believe, because this is a plastic cap. You can feel it here. This used to be metal in the original. So this is some sort of a reform. Even though it's old enough to where they still only list a couple ingredients, it's not old enough that it's the original formulation. So, it's almost a question of how deep you want to get into this. For someone like me who loves spending hours comparing the two, this is an absolute joy to be able to have both and wear both. And the fact that the modern is good enough that I would still wear this. If I ran out of this vintage, if I went through 100 ml, if I went through 2 of these, because I have a backup of the vintage, would I go out and buy another vintage? I don't know. I would probably just wear this, actually, because it is a good reformulation. And for a house that charges $20 to $25, that's what makes this house so unique and so precious, because you just, you get these houses like, some terrible reformulations, for example, come from the House of Creed. I smelled Modern Aventus a few years back. It's awful. It is not well taken care of. They've gypped on, ingredient quality. And, I'm sure they had supply chain issues, and that's why BlackRock bought them. But for a house, if a house like Lapidus or Bogart, which charges 20 to 25 bucks, can get these reformulations down, you would think some of the more expensive houses could do the same, but that's not always the case. So, this fragrance impresses me because it has a little bit of everything in there. It's got Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, which also has a vintage honey note, by the way. The vintage does. The modern stuff, the honey is almost turned down to nothing. If not, it's not there at all. But if you can find a vintage with the raised P, like I showed you on one of my previous videos, you will get that animalic honey. So it's a little bit of Paco Rabanne Pour Homme with the aromatics, feel. The aromatic fougere. But then it's a little bit of fruitiness. It's a little bit of animalic florals. It's a little bit of pissy honey, which back when they used to put price bars not on a barcode but actually written on there, and then it's a little bit of that honey and castor and civet like Coro. So I can understand the comparison to some of these fragrances, but what makes Lapidus Pour Homme so unique is that it just kind of comes at you all at once. You get this bam, this hit, and you smell everything. And it's just this blend that there's no way you would think it would work. How would pineapple, lavender, artemisia with honey, incense, pine, and florals, and petitgrain, and tobacco, and patchouli, and oak moss, and amber, and musk, and sandalwood, and tonka bean, and cedar, how would that all work? I mean, this is a master class in perfumery.